Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery for another sutta study. So we'll be going through a few verses from the Dhammapada this morning. So verses 165, 166, and 167. So we can start by paying homage to the Buddha, and then I'll go through these verses. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. So as mentioned, we'll be looking at Dhammapada verses 165, 166, and 167. So as usual, I'll read the verses in Pali and then talk about the meaning of the Pali words and also how the teaching as a whole applies to our practice. And then at the end, I'll take any questions that you might have. So you're welcome to type in questions at any time, and I'll take them at the end. So the first one, so Dhammapada verse 165, the Buddha says, Atana hikatang papang atana sankhilisati, atana akatang papang atana vavisujjati, suddhi asuddhi pachatang nanyo anyang vasodeye. So this first line, atana hikatang papang. So atana means by oneself. So again, this is the word atta being used in the ordinary everyday sense of the reflexive pronoun. So nothing to do with the concept of a higher self, but just a very simple saying in reference to one's own being. So atana, by oneself. Katang is done, papang, evil. So atana hikatang papang, evil is done by oneself. Atana sankhilisati. So by oneself, sankhilisati means one becomes defiled. So for those who are familiar with the term kilesa, sankhilisati is from the same root. So sankhilisati means to corrupt or to defile something. So he's saying evil is done by oneself, and by oneself one becomes defiled. In other words, you can't blame it on anybody else. You can't say that it's somebody else's fault, that your mind is messy or corrupted. You can't say it's somebody else's fault that you have greed and hatred and delusion. So you can't blame it on your parents, you can't blame it on your friends, you can't blame it on anybody other than yourself. So each one of us chooses for ourselves what we're going to do with our mind. We decide what we're going to do with our speech and what we're going to do with our body. Nobody else does it to us. But we decide for ourselves what choices we're going to make. So similarly, in the next phrase, the Buddha says, Atana akatang papang, atana vavisujjati. So he says, but also if evil is not done, that's also by oneself. Atana vavisujjati, and one becomes purified by oneself. So in other words, this also is saying that it's through our own decisions that we choose to put down evil, that we choose to set aside harmful choices and make good choices. And just as we are the ones who can corrupt and defile our own mind, we are also the ones who can purify and cleanse our own mind. So this is actually an incredibly hopeful message. So the Buddha here is saying that as long as we take responsibility for the defilements of our own mind, then that also means that we have the power to purify and cleanse our own mind. So we can't blame anybody else for our internal disaster, but that also means that we have the power to completely clean up the mess in our own mind if we choose to. And then the Buddha emphasizes the point saying, Suddhi asuddhi pachatang. So purity, suddhi, and impurity, asuddhi, are both dependent upon oneself. So pachatang is from the prefix patti, which means back to or returning to, and atta, which again means oneself. So pachatang means returning to oneself, depending on oneself. So suddhi, asuddhi, pachatang. So both purity and impurity depend upon oneself. And he says, nanyo anyang visodaye. So no one can purify another. So again, the Buddha is emphasizing the point here that it's up to each one of us to decide whether our mind is going to be pure or impure, whether our mind is going to be wholesome or unwholesome. Nobody else can purify your mind for you. So some people, they come to Buddhism with the idea that they just have to meet the right teacher, or they just have to meet an enlightened being, and that person will magically purify their mind for them. But that's not how it works. Even if you happen to meet an exceptional teacher, or even if you have the good fortune to meet an awakened being, you still need to purify your own mind. Nobody else can purify your mind for you. They can give you some advice, but it's always up to you to do the work on your own mind. So that's verse 165. The next one is 166, which in Pali says, Attadattang paratena bahunapi nahapaye, attadattama binyaya, sadatta pasudosiya. So this first phrase here, so attadattang paratena. So again, atta has the reflexive pronoun, so oneself, and attang, so attang, so with the aspirate T, this means the benefit or the well-being of someone, their welfare, their what truly brings benefit to them. So attadattang means one's own benefit, one's own welfare. And paratena, so para means other or another person. So paratta means the benefit of another person, the welfare of another person. And bahunapi nahapaye. Hapaye means to set aside or to neglect or discard. So nahapaye, attadattang, so one should not discard or abandon or neglect one's own welfare, paratena, for the sake of others, or by means of trying to help others. And he says, bahunapi, so bahu means a lot or many. So bahunapi, he says, even if it's a lot of people. So putting all this together, the Buddha is saying that we should not abandon our own welfare for the sake of others, no matter how many. And the next line, the Buddha says, attad attang abhinyaya. So having fully understood one's own benefit, so what actually brings benefit to oneself, sad atta pasutosiya. So sad atta means one's own benefit, and pasuto means to be focused on or committed to. So sadatta pasutosiya means one should be intent upon one's own benefit, focused upon one's own benefit. So at first glance, these verses might seem to be encouraging an attitude of selfishness. But it's good to remember that if you want to help others, then you need to get yourself in relatively good condition first. So for example, if you want to save someone who's drowning, well, it's helpful if you first learn how to swim. If you don't know how to swim, then you can't save someone who's drowning. You'll just wind up drowning right with them. So if you want to be of benefit to others, then you first need to purify your own mind to some extent. You need to make some progress in your own practice, and then that will enable you to be able to be of benefit to others. So if one, on the other hand, if one is neglecting one's own welfare for the sake of others, then you actually won't be of much benefit to other people, but you also won't make much progress yourself. So here when the Buddha is talking about one's own welfare, one's own benefit, he's not talking in ordinary sense of like who makes the most money or who has the most possessions, who has the most fame or whatever. He's not talking in a worldly sense, but rather in terms of our practice, the development of spiritual qualities, the development of the wholesome qualities of mind which contribute to awakening. So this is what we should understand. So when the Buddha says understand one's own benefit, he's talking about understanding what brings true benefit, which is the benefit of making progress towards awakening. So cultivating the factors of awakening in one's own mind. Because as one cultivates and develops those factors of awakening, then naturally one will also more clearly understand how to help other people. One will more clearly understand how to be of benefit to others. So as one's own practice advances, then one starts to more clearly understand how to help others, and also one has a natural inclination to helping others. There's a natural wish to be of benefit to others on the path. That's verse 166. Now verse 167. This one has a couple interesting things. So I'll read this one again in Pali, and then we'll talk about it. This one says, Hinang dhammang na seveya, pamadena na sangvase, mitchaditting na seveya, nasya loka vardhano. So this first line, Hinang dhammang na seveya. So hina means inferior. It actually comes from the verb which means to throw something away. So hina is that which should be thrown away. So the trash, that which is useless. So hinang, so the inferior or the worthless, the garbage, the refuse. Dhammang. So Dhamma has two main meanings in the suttas. There's some others, but the two main meanings of Dhamma are either teaching. So commonly we talk about the Buddha Dhamma, the teachings of the Buddha. That's how we most normally use the word Dhamma. But it also has a broader sense of any teaching, and in particular any spiritual teaching, any set of spiritual teachings. So also the other spiritual traditions at the time of the Buddha, they were also called Dhamma, but they were the Dhamma of Nigantanathaputta or the Dhamma of any of the other common teachers at the time. And then there was the Dhamma of Gautama Buddha, which is the one that we normally keep. So Dhamma has this broad meaning of a spiritual teaching of some sort. But also the very broadest meaning of Dhamma is simply phenomenon or thing. So any distinct thing whatsoever. So whether physical or mental, it doesn't matter. So any distinct object can be called the Dhamma. So anything whatsoever can be called the Dhamma. And na seveya. So seveya means to participate in or associate with or engage in. So the Buddha is saying one should not participate in or engage in inferior dhammas. So if one takes Dhamma in the more restricted sense of spiritual teachings, then the Buddha says one should not involve oneself in inferior teachings. So for example, I was spending a bit of time with a certain Buddhist person. And they revealed to me that they'd been spending a lot of time listening to talks about this kind of pseudo-spiritual New Age movement of manifestation where you just focus really hard on what you want and hope that it manifests in your life. And this person was saying that they actually spend more time listening to talks about this pseudo-spiritual manifestation practice than they do listening to talks about Buddhist practice. And I was very disappointed to hear this. This is one, it's a tremendous waste of time. Two, it's directly contrary to the Buddhist teachings. And three, it's actually going directly against the Buddha's advice here. He says one should not involve oneself in inferior dhammas. One should not get wrapped up in inferior spiritual teachings. So we do need to be a little bit careful about what we choose to fill our mind with. because our minds are impressionable. If you spend all your time watching violent movies, then you might find that your mind starts to develop an appreciation for violence. So it does shape the mind depending on what you put in it. Similarly, if you spend a lot of time reading like New Age pseudo-spiritual stuff or watching New Age pseudo-spiritual talks, then you'll find that that might also start to shape your mind. It will start to make the mind lean away from Dhamma and towards less accurate ways of relating to the world. And also, if we take Dhamma in the broadest sense of simply meaning phenomenon of any sort, then the Buddha is saying one should not participate in inferior activities, or one should not get involved in inferior things. So here, inferior would mean things which are not conducive to awakening. So not getting wrapped up in definitely in anything unwholesome, but also avoiding things which are just a meaningless waste of time. So really trying to keep ourselves focused on that which is superior, that which is conducive to attaining the highest wisdom, the highest happiness. And the next phrase, similarly, the Buddha says, Pamadena na sangvase. So pamada means negligence, and sangvasa means to live or to dwell. So na sangvase, one should not live. Pamadena, negligently. So this means being negligent of the Buddhist teachings, being negligent of one's own states of mind, and being negligent in the sense that one is not making a conscious effort to develop wholesome states and to discard and remove unwholesome states from the mind. So pamadena na sangvase, this one should not live negligently. This both means that one should be attentive in the sense of paying attention to everything that one does with body, speech, and mind, but also that one should be making a conscious effort at all times to discard anything unwholesome that one is engaging in, and to actively cultivate wholesome patterns of mind instead. And the next phrase, the Buddha says, Miccha ditting na seveya. So miccha ditti is wrong view, the opposite of samma ditti, so right view, which is the first of the 8 steps of the Noble Eightfold Path, the samma ditti, right view. So miccha ditti na seveya, so one should not participate in wrong view. So similarly to the first line, this is pointing out the fact that one should be careful to avoid getting wrapped up in things which are contrary to the Buddha's teachings. So right view, for example, in the suttas, right view is defined as knowing the Four Noble Truths. It's defined as understanding karma and rebirth. It's defined as understanding what is wholesome and what is unwholesome. So that's right view. So then wrong view would be, for example, people who reject karma and rebirth, people who rewrite or modify the Four Noble Truths, or who say that there's nothing wrong with desire, people who say that greed and hatred are natural and there's no problem there, people who say it's not worth doing spiritual practice, and so on. This is all in the category of wrong view. So the Buddha is saying we should be careful not to get mixed up with wrong view. So not to participate in or engage in anything which is fundamentally wrong view. So this would also include much of what these days goes under the heading of secular Buddhism. That also would fit under the category of miccha ditti, wrong view. So again, the rejection of karma and rebirth, the modification of the Eightfold Path, modification of the Four Noble Truths, this is all in the category of wrong view. And this the final phrase of this verse, the Buddha says, Nasya loka vaddano. So one should not do loka vaddana. So loka means world, and vaddana means to increase or to grow. So loka vaddana literally means world increasing. or world growing. And this is a bit of a peculiar phrase. One way of interpreting this is he's saying one should not increase worldliness. In other words, getting caught up in the ordinary, mundane things of the world. So chasing after wealth, or chasing after fame, or chasing after sensuality. This would all be in the category of worldliness. So to increase one's worldliness means to get more and more caught up in the petty, insignificant pursuits that ordinary, non-spiritual people get wrapped up in. They're saying we should be careful not to get wrapped up in those things. But there's also a somewhat more profound meaning here. So one should not grow the world, or one should not increase the world. So what does he mean by the world here? Well, it's talking about our own experience of body and mind, our own experience of sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and thought, which all arises ultimately from ignorance, from delusion. So what does all of this arise from? Well, ultimately it comes from avidya, from ignorance. So in the Paticca Samuppada, starts out avidya paccaya sankhara. So based upon ignorance or delusion, then there comes to be formations. Sankhara paccaya vijnanam. So based on formations, there is consciousness. Vijnana paccaya namarupam. Based on consciousness, there is mind and body. Namarupa paccaya salayatanam. So based on mind and body, there are the six senses, and so on. So our experience of the world then is the experience of the six senses, which ultimately is coming from ignorance, from this basic misunderstanding of the nature of reality. So out of this fundamental ignorance or delusion, we have generated an experience of body-mind. We generate this being in samsara and identify as this being. So in this sense, every time that we engage in delusion, which is all the time if you're not an awakened being, whenever we engage in delusion, we're constantly developing a world. We're constantly growing a world in our own mind. And it's a world which is centered around me, a world which is centered around our self-identity. So we're constantly creating a world around our sense of self, around our self-identity. So when he says, nasya lokavadano, so one should not increase the world, this also could be talking about this way that we're constantly building a world around our own self-identity. We're constantly constructing a world which is in relationship to me. So like, I am here, this is my body, this is my room, this is where I am doing my thing. So we're constantly building a world centered around this fundamentally delusional concept of self-existence. And because it's samsara, its very nature is suffering. Its very nature is discontent. It's dukkha. So, and the Buddha is pointing to the fact that when we engage in wrong view, when we participate in inferior dhammas, when we live negligently, then all of that leads to the increase in our samsara experience. It leads to the growth of our samsara experience. Whereas Buddhism is all about learning how to diminish and reduce our samsaric experience, learning how to diminish and reduce our dukkha. So this is where he's saying, be careful not to increase the world. He's talking about being careful not to increase our dukkha, not to increase our confusion. So that's the end of verse 167. So those were the three verses that I was going to speak about this morning. And at this time, we can respect the suttas with three sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And at this time, I can take any questions that you might have. So hello to the friends who are checking in online. So hello to Richard, John, Jeff, Douglas, Chittapala, Si Yong, Sari Smith, Jayanta, Geeta, Bhumika, Vero, Ashok, and Pamela. Welcome to all of you. And I don't actually see any questions. So if there's any questions, this is your opportunity. Or if there's no questions, then we'll go ahead and wrap up for the morning. So it doesn't look like there's any questions, so I think we'll go ahead and end at this time. So you can continue joining us every morning and evening, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday for our ongoing sutta study and Dhamma discussions. And if you're in the New Jersey area on October 23rd, you can also come and join us for our annual Katina ceremony. Otherwise, hope to see all of you again soon. We'll end at this time. Thank you.